The merciless summer sun beat down on the obstacle course, but the real heat was in the sneers of the fresh recruits. They thought the hunched, dirt-streaked farmer was just a pathetic old man in their way. They had no idea they were mocking a ghost of naval special warfare. The air at Fort Bradley hung thick and heavy like a wet wool blanket draped over the sprawling training grounds. It was late July, and the Georgia heat was unrelenting, baking the clay earth into a hard, cracked shell and turning the surrounding pine forests into a sweltering oven. For the fresh recruits of Alpha Company, it was day 32 of basic training, the phase where exhaustion sank deep into the marrow, and true character, for better or worse, began to bleed through the cracks of military discipline. Private Benjamin Carter stood at the edge of the grueling sandpit obstacle course, his chest heaving as sweat carved tracks through the camouflage paint on his face. Carter was 21, built like a collegiate linebacker, and fueled by a lifetime of small-town athletic glory. He was the kind of young man who believed the world owed him a salute simply for showing up. Next to him stood Private Lucas Reed, a wiry and eager follower who echoed Carter's every complaint and mirrored his every smirk. They had just completed a punishing 3-mile ruck march, and their nerves were frayed to the absolute limit. While the platoon took a strictly timed 2-minute water break, the heavy rumble of a battered, rust-eaten pickup truck broke the rhythmic sound of their panting. The truck, trailing a cloud of red dust, sputtered to a halt right next to the staging area of the obstacle course. The door groaned open, and a man stepped out, who looked entirely out of place amidst the cutting-edge military machinery and the young, hyper-fit soldiers. It was Samuel Hayes. To the untrained eye, Samuel was nothing more than a frail, weathered local farmer hired as a civilian contractor to deliver heavy wooden crates of specialized target mechanisms to the live-fire ranges. He wore a faded, sweat-stained flannel shirt, worn-out denim overalls, and boots that had seen decades of hard labor. A battered straw hat shaded his face, obscuring his eyes. His shoulders were hunched, and when he walked toward the truck bed, he moved with a pronounced mechanical limp, the kind of stiffness that spoke of old bones and a lifetime of grueling, unglamorous toil. His hands, gripping the tailgate, trembled slightly. "Look at this," Carter muttered, wiping a mixture of sweat and grime from his forehead. "We're out here dying, and command hires a fossil to haul our gear. Hey, old man, don't break a hip lifting that." A few recruits nervously chuckled, but Samuel didn't even turn his head. His expression remained entirely neutral, his jaw set in a relaxed, stoic line. He pulled a heavy wooden crate toward the edge of the tailgate. It was clearly too heavy for a man of his apparent frailty, weighing upwards of 80 pounds. He hooked his calloused fingers under the wooden slats and hoisted it against his chest, shuffling slowly toward the staging pavilion. "Take your time, Grandpa." Private Reed sneered, emboldened by Carter's arrogance. "Not like we have a war to train for or anything." Samuel ignored them, his eyes fixed on the pavilion table a few yards away. But the red clay beneath his boots was slick with condensation and spilled water from the recruits' canteens. As Samuel took a step, his bad leg buckled slightly. The sudden shift in weight was too much. The heavy crate slipped from his arthritic grip and hit the ground with a resounding crack, bursting open and sending heavy metal target hinges scattering across the mud. A large puddle of muddy water splashed up, splattering directly onto Private Carter's freshly polished combat boots and the lower half of his trousers. Carter's face went crimson. The exhaustion, the heat, and his own inflated ego created a toxic surge of adrenaline. He broke ranks, stepping aggressively toward the old man. "Are you completely blind, you useless old goat?" Carter barked, his voice echoing across the quiet staging area. Do you have any idea how long it takes to shine these boots? Look at you. You're pathetic. Why are you even out here? You should be in a nursing home, not getting in the way of real men doing real work." Samuel slowly straightened up, wincing slightly as his back popped. He looked up from beneath the brim of his straw hat. His eyes were a startling, piercing shade of pale blue. There was no fear in them, no embarrassment, and no anger. They were deep still and completely unbothered, like the surface of a frozen lake. "I apologize for the mess, son," Samuel said, his voice quiet, raspy, and grounded, like gravel grinding together. "The mud is slicker than it looks." "I'm not your son," Carter snapped, taking another step forward, looming over the frail farmer. He pointed a thick, mud-stained finger at Samuel's chest. "You're a liability. You civilians have no idea what it takes to stand where we stand. You've probably spent your whole life planting corn and hiding from anything remotely difficult. So pick up your trash and get out of our way before I help you find the exit." "Hey, Carter, leave it," whispered a more level-headed recruit from the back, feeling the tension escalating to a dangerous point. "No," Carter shot back. "I'm sick of this. We bust our backs out here to defend people like him, and he can't even walk in a straight line without making a mess." Samuel simply let out a slow, measured breath. He didn't raise his hands defensively. He didn't shrink back. He just looked at the massive 21-year-old with a mixture of pity and quiet endurance. "You're right about one thing," Samuel said softly. "It takes a lot to stand where you stand, but you've still got a lot of standing left to do." Carter scoffed loudly, turning to Reed and the others. "Listen to the philosopher. Go back to your tractor, old man." Samuel didn't reply. He slowly knelt down into the mud, his joints popping audibly, and began to gather the heavy metal mechanisms with shaking hands. Carter stood above him, arms crossed, radiating smug superiority, completely unaware of the shadow that had just fallen over the pavilion from the observation tower. What in the name of God is going on down here? The voice boomed across the staging area, like a crack of thunder, freezing every recruit into place. It was a voice that commanded absolute, terrifying obedience. Master Sergeant William Bull Miller marched down the wooden steps of the observation tower, his boots hammering against the planks. Miller was a legend at Fort Bradley, a mountain of a man with arms like tree trunks, a perfectly shaved head, and a chest bearing the ribbons of 4 combat tours in Iraq and Afghanistan. He was known for being uncompromising, a drill sergeant who could mentally break a recruit with a single glare, yet fiercely protective of the integrity of the armed forces. The platoon instantly snapped to attention, their heels clicking together in unison. Carter's smug expression vanished, replaced by the rigid eyes-forward mask of a terrified private. "Sir Platoon is on a hydration break. Drill Sergeant," Carter shouted, his voice cracking slightly under the immense pressure of Miller's approaching presence. Miller stopped 2 feet from Carter, his jaw clenched, his dark eyes darting from the spilled crate to the metal pieces in the mud, and finally to the old farmer kneeling on the ground. "Private Carter." Miller growled his voice, dropping to a dangerous, predatory volume. "Why is this civilian on his knees in the mud while you stand there breathing my air?" Carter swallowed hard. He thought he had the high ground. He thought the drill sergeant would take the side of his soldiers against a clumsy civilian. "Drill Sergeant, this civilian contractor dropped his cargo. He was careless, Drill Sergeant. He splashed mud on my uniform and was blocking the training path. I was simply informing him of the standard drill sergeant." Miller's eyes narrowed into slits. He slowly turned his head to look down at Samuel. Samuel hadn't stopped working. He was gathering the heavy steel hinges, stacking them neatly. The oppressive heat had caused him to sweat through his flannel shirt. To get a better grip on the heavy mud-slicked metal, Samuel reached across his body and tightly rolled up the right sleeve of his shirt, pushing the faded, torn fabric past his elbow and securing it above his bicep. As Samuel reached down for the final piece of metal, the harsh afternoon sun caught his exposed right forearm. Miller's gaze drifted toward the old man's arm, ready to order him off the range for disrupting his training schedule. But as his eyes locked onto the farmer's skin, the drill sergeant froze. The blood drained entirely from Miller's face. The terrifying, immovable mountain of a man suddenly looked as though all the air had been violently punched from his lungs. Etched into the leathery, sun-beaten skin of Samuel's forearm was a tattoo. It was heavily faded, blurred by decades of time and sun exposure, but the intricate details were still unmistakably clear to anyone who knew what to look for. It was a golden eagle wings, spread wide, clutching an anchor, a trident and a flintlock pistol. A Navy SEAL trident. But it wasn't just a standard piece of flash ink. Just above the eagle, carved through the ink, and continuing up toward the elbow, was a jagged, horrific scar that looked like a deep gouge from a high-caliber round. And beneath the trident, tattooed in faded black lettering, were 3 small characters: MACVSOG. 1968. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam. Studies and Observations Group. Carter, noticing the drill sergeant's sudden silence, smirked internally, assuming Miller was formulating the ultimate insult to hurl at the old man. Like I said, drill sergeant the old guy is frail. He can't handle the weight. Shut your mouth, Private, Miller whispered. It wasn't a yell. It was a quiet, trembling command that carried far more menace than any scream. Miller took a slow, hesitant step forward, ignoring the recruits entirely. He stared at the tattoo, his eyes tracing the jagged scar, then moved up to look at the old man's profile. He noted the way Samuel knelt, not haphazardly, but balanced, the mechanical limp suddenly making sense as the aftermath of a catastrophic combat injury, not farm labor. Samuel picked up the last piece of metal, placed it in the broken crate, and slowly stood up. He pushed the brim of his straw hat back, wiping his brow with the back of his hand, finally revealing his full face to the master sergeant. Miller's breath hitched. A profound, almost desperate look of recognition washed over the drill sergeant's hardened features. His mind flashed back to a framed photograph that sat on his grandfather's mantel, a photograph of a bruised, bloodied but unbroken young operative standing in the jungles of Southeast Asia. A man who was a ghost in the military archives, a man who had pulled Miller's own grandfather out of a burning riverboat under heavy mortar fire in the Mekong Delta. Samuel. Miller choked out the strict military protocol, completely evaporating from his voice. Samuel Hayes. Samuel turned his piercing blue eyes toward the towering drill sergeant. A faint knowing smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Hello, Billy. You've grown a bit since your granddad's funeral." A collective gasp, practically silent, but deafening in its impact, rippled through the platoon. Private Carter's eyes went wide, his brain short-circuiting as he tried to process the fact that their terrifying drill sergeant had just been addressed by his childhood nickname by a frail farmer. Miller didn't hesitate. He didn't care who was watching. The towering, fearsome master sergeant snapped into a rigid, immaculate salute, his hand trembling slightly with raw emotion. "Master Chief," Miller said, his voice thick with a respect so deep it bordered on reverence. "It is an absolute honor to have you on my ground, sir." Samuel casually wiped the mud from his hands onto his overalls and returned the salute with a crisp, effortless motion that completely belied his age, a muscle memory forged in fires these young recruits couldn't even fathom. "At ease, Billy. I'm just hauling targets today. Seems I made a bit of a mess of it." Miller lowered his hand, his eyes burning as he turned slowly back to Private Carter and Private Reed. The look on the drill sergeant's face was no longer just angry, it was lethal. "Private Carter," Miller said, his voice dangerously soft. "Do you know who you are speaking to?" Carter was trembling now, the heat of the day instantly replaced by an icy dread settling in his stomach. No, drill sergeant. This frail old man." Miller pointed a shaking finger at Samuel. "Is Master Chief, Petty Officer Samuel Hayes. He did 3 tours in Vietnam. He was awarded the Navy Cross, 2 Silver Stars and 3 Purple Hearts. He survived behind enemy lines for 11 days with a shattered femur, carrying a wounded teammate on his back. He has forgotten more about warfare sacrifice and what it means to be a real man than you will learn in your entire miserable, insignificant life." Carter's face turned the color of ash. He stared at the faded tattoo, the scars, the quiet, unbothered eyes of the man he had just viciously insulted. The arrogance was entirely stripped away, leaving only the crushing weight of his own profound ignorance. "Front-leaning rest position." Miller roared, the thunder returning to his voice, echoing violently off the trees. "All of you down. You're going to push the earth away until this Master Chief tells you to stop. And if he doesn't tell you to stop, you will push until your arms shatter." As the entire platoon scrambled desperately into the mud, dropping onto their faces in the sweltering heat, Samuel just stood quietly watching the young men. He didn't look vindictive. He didn't look triumphant. He just looked like a man who knew that the hardest lessons in life were usually learned in the dirt. The agonizing burn in Private Benjamin Carter's shoulders began almost immediately, a fiery lactic acid buildup that screamed against the brutal Georgia heat. His face hovered mere inches above the red clay mud he had so arrogantly mocked just moments before. Sweat poured from his nose, stinging his eyes and mixing with the grime. Beside him, Private Lucas Reed was already shaking, letting out small, suppressed groans of pain with every agonizing repetition. The entire platoon, 32 young men who had believed themselves to be the pinnacle of modern warriors, were now unified in absolute physical misery, pushing the earth away under the unyielding gaze of a ghost. Drill Sergeant William Bull Miller paced slowly among them. His heavy combat boots squelched in the wet dirt, a rhythmic, terrifying sound that promised no mercy. He did not yell right away. The silence of the imposing drill instructor was somehow infinitely worse than his typical deafening roars. It allowed the heavy gravity of the situation to settle deep into the bones of every recruit. They were not just being punished for a lack of discipline, they were doing penance for a profound lack of respect. "Down," Miller commanded softly. The platoon descended, holding the excruciating bottom position of the push-up muscles, trembling violently. "Up!" They rose, a collective gasp of agony filling the humid air. Miller stopped pacing and stood directly over Carter. "You think you are tough, Private Carter," Miller said, his voice echoing across the silent obstacle course. "You think because you can run 3 miles and shine a piece of leather that you understand what it means to be a soldier. You understand nothing. You look at a man out of uniform, a man who moves with a limp, and you see weakness. Let me tell you about that limp." Miller turned to face the entire platoon, though they were still staring firmly at the dirt. In November of 1968, Master Chief Hayes was operating deep behind enemy lines in the dense, unforgiving jungles of the Mekong Delta. His team, a small unit of elite MACVSOG operatives, was compromised during a reconnaissance mission. They were ambushed by a battalion-sized element of regular North Vietnamese army soldiers. They were outnumbered 50 to 1. The only sounds were the desperate panting of the recruits and the distant rustle of the pine trees in the hot wind. Carter's arms felt as though they were being torn from their sockets, but he did not dare drop to his knees. The story held him captive, replacing his arrogance with a sickening sense of awe and shame. Master Chief Hayes took a heavy-caliber machine gun round to the right femur during the opening minutes of the firefight. Miller continued his voice, thick with raw, unadulterated reverence. The bone was shattered. Most men would have gone into immediate shock. Most men would have laid down and waited for the end. The Master Chief did not. He applied a makeshift tourniquet under heavy mortar fire, dragged himself to a fortified position, and provided covering fire for his team for 6 straight hours. Samuel Hayes stood quietly near his battered pickup truck. He had not asked for this grand recounting of his past. He did not seek validation from these young men, or even from the drill sergeant. He merely watched them with those deep, unbothered blue eyes, his face a stoic mask of weathered leather. He adjusted the brim of his straw hat, seemingly more concerned with the blistering sun than the legendary tales of his own heroism. When the extraction chopper finally arrived, Miller's voice grew louder, carrying the immense weight of the history he was sharing. It could not land due to the intense anti-aircraft fire. The team had to move through 300 yards of dense, hostile swamp to reach a secondary clearing. Master Chief Hayes refused to be left behind, and he refused to slow them down. He tied himself to another wounded operative, my grandfather, Petty Officer First Class James Miller, and they dragged each other through that swamp. They fought their way out, tooth and nail, bleeding and broken, because they understood something you clearly do not, Private Carter. They understood sacrifice. Carter squeezed his eyes shut. A tear of absolute humiliation broke through the sweat on his cheek. The image of the frail farmer, the man he had called a useless old goat, dragging another wounded man through a swamp with a shattered leg, was completely shattering his worldview. The heavy wooden crate that Samuel had been carrying, the one that had slipped from his arthritic grip, suddenly seemed like a feather compared to the monumental burdens he had carried in his youth. "Down," Miller ordered again. The platoon lowered themselves. "Hold it." "They survived," Miller said softly, his voice dropping back to a terrifying whisper. "My grandfather came home, married his sweetheart, and had a family. I exist because of the man standing by that truck, the man you just told to get out of your way, the man you said belonged in a nursing home." "Drill sergeant, please." Carter choked out his voice, cracking with genuine physical and emotional pain. "I didn't know." Ignorance is not an excuse for a lack of basic human decency, Private. Miller roared, the sudden explosion of sound causing several recruits to flinch. "You wear the same flag on your shoulder that he bled for. You stand on the ground he secured up." The platoon pushed back, up a ragged, uncoordinated movement, born of total exhaustion. Several recruits collapsed onto their stomachs, their arms finally giving out, but they quickly scrambled back into the front, leaning rest, terrified of the drill sergeant's wrath. Samuel slowly stepped forward. He walked with that same pronounced limp, the mechanical stiffness that now commanded absolute respect rather than derision. He moved past the commanding presence of Master Sergeant Miller and stood at the edge of the mud puddle, looking down at the broken bodies of Alpha Company. "Billy," Samuel said quietly. The informal name, spoken with such casual authority, cut through the tension like a hot knife. Miller immediately snapped to attention, facing the old farmer. "Master Chief, that's enough," Samuel said softly. "They've learned the lesson." Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second, his protective anger still simmering, but he would never disobey a direct order from a man like Samuel Hayes. He turned back to the platoon. "Platoon, recover." 32 exhausted recruits collapsed into the red clay, groaning and rolling onto their backs, completely spent. Carter remained on his hands and knees, staring at the mud, his chest heaving violently. He felt sick to his stomach, overwhelmed by the crushing reality of his own arrogant foolishness. The afternoon sun continued its relentless assault on the training grounds of Fort Bradley. The heat waves shimmered above the asphalt of the nearby roads, creating the illusion of water where there was only dry, unforgiving earth. The recruits of Alpha Company lay scattered like fallen leaves across the staging area, their chest rising and falling in desperate, ragged gasps. The air tasted of dust, sweat, and copper. For the first time in 32 days of basic training, there was no whispering, no complaining, and no shuffling. There was only absolute, stunned silence. Samuel Hayes took a slow, deliberate step toward Private Benjamin Carter. The young man was still on his hands and knees, his head hanging low between his trembling arms. The mud that Carter had been so fiercely proud of, keeping off his polished boots, now covered him, entirely staining his uniform and his pride. Samuel looked down at the large, athletic youth, seeing past the muscle and the arrogance, straight into the terrified, unformed core of a boy who was trying desperately to play the role of a hardened man. "Stand up, son," Samuel said. His voice was not angry. It did not carry the booming, authoritative weight of a military commander, nor did it hold the smug satisfaction of a man who had just been violently vindicated. It was simply tired, gentle, and profoundly patient. Carter swallowed hard, forcing his screaming muscles to obey. He pushed himself off the ground, his boots slipping slightly in the wet clay. He stood up straight, locking his knees, and brought his hands to the seams of his trousers, assuming a rigid position of attention. He did not look at his face. He could only bring himself to stare fixedly at the faded and torn flannel shirt below the collar. "Look at me," Samuel instructed quietly. Carter slowly raised his eyes. He met the piercing, pale blue gaze of the former Master Chief. Up close, the lines on his face were even deeper, a complex topographical map of a life lived in extreme conditions. But there was no malice in those eyes. "I owe you an apology, sir," Carter said, his voice shaking. "I was entirely out of line." Carter continued the words, tasting like ash in his mouth. "I was disrespectful, arrogant, and foolish. I judged you by your appearance, and I failed to uphold the standards of the uniform I am trying to earn. I am deeply sorry, Master Chief." Samuel nodded slowly, accepting the apology without a hint of triumph. He reached up and adjusted his straw hat, shielding his eyes from the brutal glare of the sun. "You are strong, Private." Samuel began, his raspy voice carrying easily in the silent air. "You are fast. You are young. You have all the physical tools necessary to be a capable soldier. But physical strength is the cheapest commodity in the armed forces. Any man can run a mile or lift a heavy crate if you train him hard enough." Samuel gestured toward the broken wooden crate and the scattered metal hinges lying in the mud. "You looked at me and saw weakness because I dropped a box. You thought that because my body is old and broken, my worth was diminished. But the uniform you wear, the flag you pledge to defend, does not care about your physical strength. It cares about your character. It cares about what you do when the heavy crate you are carrying is not made of wood and steel but of fear, exhaustion, and the lives of the men standing next to you." Private Lucas Reed, who had scrambled to his feet a few yards away, listened intently, his own previous smirks replaced by a look of intense, quiet reflection. The profound lesson was sinking into the entire platoon. "Arrogance will get you killed, son," Samuel said softly. "It will make you blind to the terrain, deaf to the enemy, and a danger to your unit. Humility is what keeps a soldier alive. Humility is understanding that you are just one small, fragile piece of a massive machine, and your only job is to do your part without demanding glory or recognition." Carter felt a lump form in his throat. He finally understood that true toughness was not about projecting an image of invincibility. "Yes, Master Chief," Carter whispered. Samuel smiled, reaching out to place a rough, calloused hand on his muddy shoulder. "You will learn," Samuel said. "You have a good drill sergeant. Always listen to him. And next time an old man drops his cargo, just give him a hand." Samuel turned away, his limp pronounced, as he walked back toward the broken crate in the mud. "Platoon!" Carter shouted, suddenly, his voice ringing out with a new, unfamiliar kind of authority. "Move." Before Drill Sergeant Miller could even open his mouth to issue a command, all of the recruits of Alpha Company broke formation. They ignored screaming muscles and the oppressive heat. They rushed toward the mud puddle swarming the broken crate. Carter reached the crate first. He gently but firmly moved in front of Samuel. "Please, sir, allow us to do this," Carter said firmly. Samuel stepped back, watching in silence, as the platoon formed an efficient assembly line. Within 60 seconds, the spilled cargo was stacked perfectly in the truck. The drill sergeant finally broke the silence. "Right face," Miller commanded. The platoon executed the movement flawlessly. Forward march. As Alpha Company marched away from the sand pit, their boots hitting the ground in perfect unison, the sound was no longer just the chaotic shuffling of tired boys, but the steady, disciplined heartbeat of a unified team forged in the mud by a ghost they would never forget.